Welcome to the Ultimate Beginner Quilt Series by Fat Quarter Shop. In this series, I'm going to be showing you how to make a quilt all the way from the start to the finish. This series is sponsored by Moda Fabrics and Eversewn Sewing Machines. I'm going to be giving you lots of tips, and we're going to be building our first quilt together. In this video, I'm going to show you how you put the entire Ultimate Beginner Quilt series together. So we've got all 3 blocks. You can check back our previous videos if you would like to make these blocks. And today we're going to add sashing, borders, and binding and get our quilt top all done. So let's get started and make sure to subscribe to the Fat Quarter Shop YouTube channel. So I'm going to start with my background piece, and we're going to first cut all of our fabrics that are going to be our sashing and our inner border. In your pattern, those are the cuts A, B, C1, and C2. So the first thing you do is iron your fabric nice and flat, and I'm going to fold my fabric along the fold. You want this fold right here to be 100% straight if you're going to cut in stacks. Now I've done the math for you, and what would be really easy for this is if you take your fabric and cut 10 2.5 by width of fabric strips. That's going to make it super easy for you. So you can either make a straight edge and cut 10 strips, or you can fold it like I have and do 5 strips, because that's going to be 5 times 2 is 10. So the most important thing is for this fold to be nice and stacked right on top of each other. This is the salvage end. Don't worry about the salvage end. So I'm going to take my ruler and put my line right on the fold. I'm going to cut wide enough to cut all 4 layers off. And you can tell that I've gone through all of my layers, so I've got a straight edge. I'm going to rotate my fabrics nicely. Now my fold is at the top, and that's fine. And we're going to cut 5 2.5-inch strips to start. And I am going to be lining up the top of my ruler with the fold, because it needs to unfold and you need this to be nice and straight. So I'm going to do 1 cut. Okay, that's going to be your first cut, and that's going to give you 2 strips. We're going to keep going. So again, I'm lining up the fold and the left edge. That's going to give me 4 strips total. We're going to keep going. Now if you want to cut 2 at one time, you can put the line on the 5-inch and cut 5-inch. Move it back to 2.5. And that's going to give you 2 cuts within. So that's 4 total. 4 cuts, which is 8 strips. 1 more cut. And we have 10 total 2.5 by width of fabric strips. So I'm going to put those at the top. So from our cutting, we're going to take the 10 2.5-inch strips and subcut. We're going to cut 6 2.5 by 12.5-inch rectangles, which are going to be our A's and part of our sashing. We're going to cut 2 2.5 by 40.5-inch strips for B, 2 2.5 by 40.5-inch strips for C1, and 3 2.5 by width of fabric strips for C2. So for our A's, we need 6 2.5 by 12.5-inch rectangles. So we're going to take 3 strips and stack them. And you want to line up the top and the bottom so they're nice and straight, and we're just going to subcut this into 12.5. So I'm going to cut one end off, rotate. I'm going to put the 12.5-inch line on the line we just cut right here. Line up the top, line up the 2.5, and subcut. And these are going to be your A's. For B and C1, we need 2.5 by 40.5-inch strips. So what we're going to do there is we're going to open our strips and we're going to go iron these creases out real quick, and after we iron those out, we're going to come back. So I'm going to go iron this little crease out real quick. Okay, so now we have 4 strips. We need to mark this at 40.5 inches and cut. So 40.5 divided by 2 is 20.25. So I'm going to line this up on my mat, which is the only time I ever use a mat is when I have a really long cut. So I'm going to line this up 20.25 and cut. And again, this is the only time I ever for something really long like this. So this will be a B strip. Put it on my design board and label it. We're going to do one more like that for B. And again, you're lining up the top and the bottom so it's nice and straight, right on that edge, and cutting 20.25. Now, if you have a longer mat, you could just measure 40.5 and cut. I just don't have a long mat here, so this is what we're doing. It works just as good. So this is another B. Our C1s are the same size. So we're going to do these, and you notice that I'm doing one at a time just because it's got a fold on the end, and I feel like if we stack too many, they might be inaccurate. So I'm going to do 20.25 right here. This is a C1. And we're going to do one more like this. So I've got that cut, and I'm going to just label these with my alphabetties as C1. And our last 3 strips are C2s, and those are going to stay just like that. We're going to piece those into borders later. So we've got all of our background cut, and now we can move to our outer border and binding, which is our blue fabric. From our blue fabrics, we're going to be cutting 6 3.5 by width of fabric strips, which is our fabric D, and 6 2.5 by width of fabric strips for our E, which is our binding. So the same thing, I'm going to take my blue fabric, iron it really nice and crisp and flat, and I'm going to line up the 2 folds at the bottom, and I'm going to make sure this is nice and flat. You don't want to have any wrinkles, because if you have wrinkles, then your piece will come out bigger. So I get it nice and flat, and we're going to do a straight edge again. And I'll be cutting through 2 layers at a time. Again, this saves time. And you can do that as long as the bottom fold is lined up nicely. If it's not lined up nicely, you will get wavy strips. So I'm going to do a cut. And then I also look, and I can tell that my cut didn't go through my bottom layer because it's not all the way. So I'm going to cut a little bit fatter to get a clean line. And just make sure it went through all of my layers. And it did. So from here, I'm going to rotate my fabric. Now you'll notice I don't pick up my fabric and move it. I just rotate it on the mat so it stays together. And for our borders, we need 6 3.5 by 2.5 inch strips. So if I'm gonna double that, I only need 3. So 6 divided by 2 is 3. So I'm gonna line this up, the 3.5 and the top fold. Cut once, and you'll notice also I move my fabric from the right to the left and keep going. I don't touch the right fabric because that still needs to be cut, so the less you move it, the better off you will be. So I line up the top and the bottom. So that's 4. So these are our 6 strips that are our fabric D, so I'm just going to fold them in half so they fit on my design board. Label them with D. And then we're going to cut 6 2.5 by width of fabric strips for our binding. And so here I can tell that my fabric moved. So I'm going to rotate it again and do another straight edge because my fabric moved and I want it to be accurate. So I've got the bottom lined up, straight cut, and then rotate gently. And then I need to cut 3 times at 2.5. My fabric is doubled, so that will give me 6. So that's 1. 2. 3. So I will just stack those together. Label those with E. And now I have everything cut for the finishing and we can start assembling our quilt. We're going to begin building our quilt with our rows. Now, if you follow your diagram, you're going to put these fabric A rectangles between your blocks. So I've laid out block 1 by following my diagram. Your fabric A and fabric B are going to be considered your sashing. And I'm going to show you a couple different ways of how you can put your sashing onto your blocks. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put one of my fabrics right on top of my block 1. And you're going to see that the sashing probably will be slightly longer than my block. And that's normal because when you piece a block, sometimes it shrinks and that's totally normal. So you're going to pin in the very left and the very right, and you're going to see that there is bulk there. So you're going to pull it. You're just going to kind of pin, like evenly distribute your bulk a little bit, and pin, and pin, and pin. So we're going to do this on both, and then when we go to the sewing machine, I'm going to show you there's 2 different ways you can sew your sashing on, and it's really personal choice. So we're going to do the same thing on this block. Pin at the very top and bottom, and you're going to have some waves. You just tap it out with your fingers. This is totally normal. This happens on all my quilts. Your quilts will turn out totally fine, just like this. Just a little bit of wave. I'm going to put this here, put this on my design board, and we are going to go to the sewing machine. I'm going to show you 2 different ways you can sew this down. So when you're sewing and you have one piece that is bigger or longer, like the sashing piece, you would turn your fabric over and sew from the back because your feed dog will pull in the bottom easier. So this is the first way you can sew it together. And by doing it this way, you can make sure all of your seams stay flat. And you can see this looks nice and flat. There's no bulkiness and you don't see any waves. It just looks nice and flat. You could also sew with the sashing on top. I think for beginners, you should put the sashing on the bottom. So we're just gonna do it that way. The second way would be to put this on top, but I think for a beginner, you would put it on the bottom. Now, if you ever have a quilt block that has tons and tons and tons of seams, you would want to put that on the bottom. And so you can see it looks nice and flat. Now we're gonna go back to our cutting table. So before I finish my row and add all of my pieces, I think it's nice to stop and iron. So again, you're gonna set your seam nice and flat. And you can see that by putting the sashing on the bottom, it just worked it in. It's nice and flat. I'm gonna finger press this to one side, like always. We're gonna be pressing toward our sashing. So I'm gonna finger press this nice and flat. And then press. And with a big long seam like this, it's really good to put the edge of your iron right on there. We're going to do the same thing on our other one. It's nice and flat. So what you don't want to do is you don't want to trim your sashing down to smaller than 12.5. When I was a beginner, I used to do that and I thought, oh, it'll all work out. I'll just trim it down a little bit. Well, in the end, it won't work. It'll really scrunch up on you. So just try to not do that. I know it's like really hard to resist trimming it down, but don't do that. So now we're gonna go back and lay out the rest of our row. So now we've laid our row back out and we can actually pin it all together now. So the first thing I'm gonna do is put this right side together. I like to pin with the sashing on top so I can see how to ease it in. So again, top and bottom pins. And then just ease it in. And then you can actually go ahead and add this side. So again, top and bottom. I'm going to rotate it. You just tap it, it will ease it all in just for you so that you don't have to really do it. It just kind of eases in. And then I'm going to put this on my design board and we're going to go stitch both of these down. So again, I'm going to put the sashing on the bottom so the feed dogs can pull that through. We're going to stitch the first one. And then I'm just going to go to my other one that I've already pinned, put the sashing on the bottom, and now we can go iron row 1. So now we have row 1 pieced. We just have to iron the last 2 seams. So this one needs to be pressed, so I'm gonna flatten the seam, set the seam, finger press toward my sashing. And when you are putting blocks together, you're gonna really have to finger press a lot more than when you're doing the blocks. If you get it nice and flat here and just run your iron over it, you won't have any duck pleats. And I know I say that in every video, but I don't like to see those. Okay, so here, I'm gonna also do the same thing. And I'm gonna finger press it first because it gets it nice and flat, and you will get less puckers on the back if you just finger press it exactly how you want it. And when the iron is hot, it will do it better. If you don't iron it first, you're not gonna have any heat to hold that. So we have row 1 done, nice and easy. Just take your time putting it together. If you get frustrated because you're working with bigger pieces, just walk away from your sewing machine and come back. But what I want you to do right now, stop the video and go ahead and get row 1, row 2, and row 3 done, and then we will put all of the quilt together. Now we have all 3 rows sewn together, and we're gonna lay out row 1 and row 2 and add our fabric B. We don't have row 3 out yet just because we don't have enough room. And so you're gonna notice that your sashing will probably end up longer than your blocks that are put together, and that's okay, that always happens. So I'm gonna take one of my fabric B sashing strips, fold it in half, and mark the center. I like to just mark it with a pin, and then I'm gonna fold one of my rows in half, and the center is right here where this point is. So the first thing I'll do is line up my center, my 2 centers, pin at the left and the right. And then to make it easier to pin, I'm gonna rotate it. And you're gonna see that it is the same thing where it's got waves. So I'm just gonna ease the waves in. That's literally what I do at home. And then we're just gonna pin throughout. And you won't even notice, when you get this sewn together, you will not notice any of that waviness. I like to put a lot of pins in so that when I go to my sewing machine, it stays nice and straight. Of course, I pin more than most people, but I really like it. So just get it all pinned. So I'm gonna just kind of fold this up, move it out of the way from my design board, and we're gonna do the same thing on row 1 and our first sashing. Pin in the center. You could also make a crease in the center if you wanted to, and then line up the creases. I just don't like to do that because then I have to iron the crease out. So I prefer a pin. So again, line up your centers. Pin the left and the right, or each end, however you want to call it. And then I'm just going to ease my fabric in. And then you're just going to pin it down. And what you're trying to do here is just make the waves kind of even throughout, and you're not even going to notice. It's going to be just the same as before. And this happens to all quilters. You know, sometimes people say, oh, my block is not exactly the right size. Mine never are, as you can see, and it will work out perfectly fine. When your quilt is done, you will never see it. So I have all these pins in. And when I have all these pins, I like to just kind of fold it in half. And we're going to take these to our sewing machine. So again, here you have 2 options. You can either put the sashing on the top or the bottom. I'm going to put the sashing on the bottom so that the feed dogs can really work that in. So you're just going to stitch all the way down. And having the pins in is going to help because your fabric will be flat on the edge instead of like that. And if everything I'm going to continue sewing my next row. I'm not going to cut apart, I'm just going to keep going. I can cut it apart now. And you see that now we're getting to points or intersections that have a little bit more fabric, so I'm just going to kind of go a little bit slow and just work that fabric in. And if you see a point here that you need to, that you can tell is a 1/4 inch away, you can try to make sure that the needle hits it. I actually don't pay attention to that because mine usually just hits, but if you're new and you want to, you can just kind of pay attention here. I just use my finger to keep my seams flat. And I do remove my pins before I go over them. And now we can go iron. So now we're going to press toward our sashing. First, set your seam throughout. It is really important to set your seam on a border. If you don't, your borders will be wavy when you press them out. So really take the time on your borders to press them nice and flat before you press them toward the sashing. So see how much flatter it is now than it was before. It's all nice and flat and all those waves are eased in. And now while my fabric is still hot, I'm going to finger press to the white. And I'm going to get all the flatness out so that I don't have any duck pleats all the way down. And then I'm going to put my iron right on the edge of that seam and just go straight down. And you can tug at your sashing a little bit to pull it away if you want to make sure that it's nice and flat. And you notice when I'm ironing, I'm not moving my iron too much. I'm just moving it along that edge. So now you can see all those waves have disappeared. It's nice and flat. And do the same thing. Just kind of fold this nicely, and I'm gonna do the same thing on my row 2. So you can see the waviness right there, and we're gonna flatten it out. And you'll see how nice and flat it is. Now, it's flat. Again, finger press to one side. And when you're finger pressing, you're kind of just making sure that all your seams go the way you want. You want to press toward the white because then you're pressing away from all of those seams. Get it nice and flat. And then press right on the edge of that iron. And ta-da, my points are coming out nice, so that's wonderful. Now at this point, if my points don't line up exactly, I'm more likely to leave them in. So now you can see there are some points. Mine are all matching, but if they didn't match, I would probably just leave it as it is. I'm more particular about my points matching within my block, and here I just leave it. And you can see my iron just kind of got a little bit of water on it, and that's okay. So now we're gonna go back and lay out the rest of our rows. So now I've laid out my rows, all of my rows, and before I start pinning, I'm gonna mark the center of all 3 of the sections that are left. So I'm gonna pin the sections. So I'm gonna pin the rows. So I'm gonna pin the middle. So I've got my middle mark. On this middle piece, I've got to mark the middle on both the top and the bottom. And doing the pin in the middle is an extra step, but it's going to give you better results. So, got everything pinned in the middle, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to pin all of this together at once because that's what I do at home and it saves time. If you don't want to do that, you can do it in 2 separate steps. So I'm going to start with the bottom section, match up my centers, and pin. And a lot of times beginning quilters just don't like to pin, so they don't pin here. And I would just say give pinning a try because your long arm quilter will really appreciate it, I can tell you that. Got one end. Just gonna and I will say that when I first started quilting, doing the final quilt assembly was always the hardest part. It took me a long time to really perfect it, so if it's not coming out perfect, that's okay. You'll get better as time goes on. Don't worry about it, don't sweat it, just do your best, and pinning will help. I always say the more pins, the better. And the wavier it is, the more pins I put in. So we've got that. Now we've got to put the top to here. Just scoot it down. Match my centers. I usually pin to the left and the right of the center. I like to use nice thin pins. The pins that I like are always 0.5 millimeters. Anything thicker I won't use, because I feel like they put too much of a hole in your fabrics. So 0.55 is what I always use. So I've got it all pinned, and I will just take it to my sewing table just like this and start sewing. So again, I've got my sashing on the bottom, and here, just to warn you, you might poke yourself a little bit, and that's okay. I've already poked myself once, it's okay. And as you're going, you know, you can just make sure your seams stay the way they're going. So if you're sewing here, you don't want this seam to flip up. So you just kind of keep it. And your goal is for the beginning and the end to be a 45-degree angle. So you've got that, and my other end should look very similar. And now I'm going to rotate to the other side and sew with the sashing face down. Now as you get more experience, you can put the sashing on top. I actually, when I sew, put the sashing on top because I like my seams on the bottom, but for a beginner, I would do it this way. And you can see I'm adjusting as I'm going to keep everything lined up. Now we can go iron our quilt center. So we're doing the same thing again. You're going to see it's nice and wavy. We're going to flatten it out and then press toward the sashing. And as your quilt grows, it's bigger and bigger, but I still do the same technique throughout. It just takes a little bit more time. Same thing on the last seam. And I really do take my time. I know this video is going to be really long, but I really do take my time making sure everything is flat. And now we can start adding our inner borders. Okay, so I have grabbed my C1 strips off of my design board. I'm going to find the center and mark both of those. And I am going to be adding to my sides first. So I'm going to turn my quilt and find the center of each side. So I'll put a pin here. It's actually, there's an intersection there, so I know where the center is. And I'm going to pin the first border down. Now that you have the center done, doing the borders is going to be a breeze. Super easy, especially the outer border because you won't have any seams. So again, I'm just easing the border in. And again, the more pins, the better. Flip the quilt and do the same thing. Find the center. And the center is an intersection. So this is the center. Pin each side and then pin all the way through. And I kind of just put my stomach right on the edge of the table so that it doesn't fall off. It's easier. And you can see one side of my quilt has more waves than the other, and that is why it's important to measure your borders and put the exact measurement on. If you didn't, you would have a wobbly quilt. This is basically by using the exact size of a strip on both sides, your quilt is going to end up the same. So we're going to go to the sewing machine, but one thing that I do different than everybody else is I backstitch. When I start doing my borders, I backstitch at the beginning and end on inner and outer borders always, because that is where the weight of your quilt is, and I don't want my quilts to fall apart. So you're going to notice that I do that when I start attaching them. So I'm going to take a couple stitches, 3 or 4, and I'm going to back stitch and then go straight, and that secures the ends. And again, my sashing, and again, my border is on the bottom. Now you can see right here where this flying geese, it's not exactly straight. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to keep it as straight as I can and just let that hang over just a little bit. And I do use my fingers a lot in this process. So I'm going to go all the way to the end, back stitch 3 or 4 stitches, and go back to the end. And you can see how many extra stitches I have there. And it's just really important because you've got all that weight, it's not going to start pulling off. So I will flip my quilt and do the other side. And again, start, back stitch. And if your machine doesn't have a back stitch, I would just stitch a little bit, cut your thread off, and then re-stitch on top of it, so that you have a little bit more hold on the ends. And now we can add our top and bottom inner borders. So here I'm doing the same exact pressing techniques. So to add our top and bottom inner borders, we've got to piece them together. So we're going to take our C2 strips and we're going to join all three of them. So the first thing I'm going to do is stack all three just one end. Nice and flat. And we're going to make a straight edge. So I'm going to use my ruler, line it up, get it as close to the selvage as you can. And then I'm going to pin them at the table. So we're going to put two together to begin. Okay. So I'm going to put one strip on top, right sides together, and I do leave a gap here, and I will show you why. I'm going to put pins in. Put lots of pins in here since this will move a lot. And I keep them away from the center, which is where I'm going to stitch. But I'm going to stitch from top left to bottom right. And if you're ever not sure if your line is going the right way, you just flip it and then you make sure that it makes a line. Because when I was a beginner, sometimes I would sew the wrong way and my strips would not make a line. The reason I leave a gap is because when I get down here, I want to make sure I go exactly to this point so that my strip, when it comes out, is nice and straight and isn't out of alignment. So then I'm going to add to the end of this. Put a straight edge at the top. Put lots of pins. And then if my line is going to go this way, I just check. Oop, that's going the right way. Good. Put my last pin in. And it's okay that my selvage is on here because I'm going to trim that off. And I like to be able to see this so that I know I'm going right to the point. So we are going to go to our sewing machine and stitch these down. So the first thing is I'm going to switch my foot from a 1/4 inch to an open toe. Start with a leader. And with this open toe foot, you can see right here where your thread is and where your needle is, and you want to sew directly on this line. Not to the left, not to the right, just directly on it. And the middle of this foot has a little arrow that you can follow also. And when I get to this end, I'm gonna make sure I end right where it touches the other fabric. And if you had a straight edge here, you wouldn't be able to see that. Okay, now I'll remove my pins. And I will just bring my other one over, and that's how this saves time. You can just keep sewing. You don't have to align it when you get to your sewing machine. So I'm gonna go here, stitch directly on that line. And you're sewing on the bias, so I don't really remove my pins until the end, just because I want everything to stay in place. And again, I want to end up right at that intersection. So now we can go and cut and press. So now we need to trim a 1/4 inch off. So I'm just going to make this straight cut this little piece off from the back, and just trim approximately a 1/4 inch away. And I like to use long scissors to do that. You could also use your rotary cutter. So first, you're going to set your seam, press to one side, either side, and then we're going to turn it over and press open. I always press them open so that your borders will lie flat on your quilt. So there you go. The other one. So it's nice and flat, and we are going to go subcut these down to the size that we need for the top and bottom border, but I am going to iron out any creases that I see before I do that. And these are just the creases from the fold on the bolt. I like to get those out. So on your pattern, we're going to subcut this full strip set into 2.5 by 44.5 inch strips. So now I have 2 strips. They need to measure 44.5 inches wide. So my mat is not wide enough to do a full 44.5. So 44.5 divided by 2 is 22.25. So I'm going to align this on my mat and trim right at the 22.25. And since I have folded that in the center, I'm going to go ahead and mark the center. That'll make it easy. Do the same thing over here. Make sure everything is nice and flat. I can mark my center if I want already, and we're going to cut at the 22.25. And I do keep a calculator in my sewing room, and you just want to double check before you cut your math. So now this is the size that we're going to go ahead and add to our quilt. So I'll just lay those out. So this is the top and bottom. We're going to find the center. And when you lay your border down, You just want to be careful. When I was a beginner, I always did the wrong side. So I would put it down wrong, and then when I flipped it up, my seam would show. So just make sure your border is right side down so you can see that. So the very center is right here. You can see my crease. Pin that. And anytime you want to know, you just kind of flip it up for pretend, and then you can tell. But right sides together, pin at the left and the right. Again, like we've been doing, and we're just doing the same thing we've been doing throughout. And I know that adding borders can be really tedious. So make sure you take a break if you need a break. Don't rush it. Don't feel like at the end of your project you just want to like rush, and you know, you've been taking your time making these blocks throughout, so just take your time doing the borders. If you get frustrated, walk away. Go to Starbucks, then come back, and you'll be ready to go. Sometimes I think people just rush to the end, and then their quilts aren't square. And when I'm pinning, I just make sure the very edges of my fabrics are as even as they can be. And doing the inner border is always harder. The outer border is going to be much easier, you'll see. Okay, so we've got that pinned. Turn it around. Find the center and do the same thing again. Right sides together, and if you want to check, you can do that. And there's nothing like putting the border on the wrong side and then having to unrip that big long seam. It's no fun at all. So now we can go sew them down. So now we're going to switch our foot from the open toe back to the 1/4 inch. Start with our leader. Put our border face down like we've been doing with the sashing. You're going to start back stitch, a back stitch all the way to the back, and then just keep going. other side. Back stitch. And when you're sewing your borders on, you want to keep the entire quilt on your table and not off your table. If it's off the table, the weight of the quilt is going to pull. So just keep as much of the quilt on your table as you can. And I know my fingers might be getting in the way on the video, but I'm trying to keep all of my seams flat. Back stitch. So you're doing the same technique that we've been doing the whole time. Set your seams. And you can see when I attached the border, I kept this seam nice and flat and open. And you can see how nice and flat that seam is. It's flat and you can't even see it. And also you can see how flat this seam is. It's not a duck pleat because if you don't push all the way out, your seam is going to be like this instead of like this. And now we're ready to move to our outer borders. Now we're going to take our Fabric D outer strips from our design board, and we're going to do the same thing we did with our inner border. So we're going to stack them all on top of each other, just one layer, because only one side needs to be trimmed, not both sides. And I just keep it nice and flat. And we're going to trim one end, and then we're going to be joining all of these together. So I'm going to line up right here. Make sure you cut through all of the selvages. So I kind of flip through and make sure all my selvages are going to be cut off, and trim. And then we're going to do just like what we did on the top and bottom inner borders, and we're going to put them all together. So we're going to start with one. So we're going to put right sides together, and again, I like to leave this little edge so that I can stitch directly to that point, and I will have more accuracy that way. You don't have to do that, but it saves time, and it just really, really helps. It's something I learned recently. So I've got this. This is a bias edge. That's why I have so many pins, and I'm going to draw a line from corner to corner, and we're going to stitch directly on that line. And keeping these pins in, it's going to make it quicker when we get to the machine. So we're just going to fold this back, add another one, and again, if you have questions on if you're drawing the line the right way, you would just go like this, and you would know. That was the biggest mistake I made when I first started quilts, is I would sew the strips, and I would have some kind of crazy L instead of a strip. And you just flip this one up to make sure you're still on the right side. And I just do all of these at one time. You can do them separately if you want and just go slowly. I'm just used to doing it, and I like to get everything pinned before I go to the sewing machine. Now I'm going to show you on this one, if you drew the line the wrong way, what would happen. So if you drew the line this way on accident, this is what you would get. You would get some crazy thing like that. So you can always check by just flipping before you stitch. It took me a long time to actually realize that, and then I was like, oh, that would have saved me time. So I should have all my seams drawn, and we can go stitch on our lines. So we're going to change our foot back to the open toe foot, set our 1/4 inch foot aside, stitch on my leader. And it's much easier to sew from this angle than this angle. This angle would be a little messy, so easier to start this way. Again, align the little arrow on your foot with the line. Just sew directly on that line. And remember, you're trying to go right to this point right there. And by having this fabric here, you can see it. If it wasn't there, you wouldn't know if your point was really lining up with the back. I'm just going to chain piece all of these together. So right to the intersection where the two fabrics meet. And now we can go press them open. So now you're just going to cut your little pieces apart. These are your just chain piece together to save time. We're going to take each one, trim up a 1/4 inch, and trim a 1/4 inch. I'm going to do that on all of these. Okay, so now we're going to press. I just start at one end. I want to get all of these creases out also that are from the bolt. So I can do those as I go. Set the seam flat. Press to one side. Then press open, and you're going to do that all the way down the entire strip. So now that we have attached our fabric D strips end to end, we're going to subcut two 3.5 by 44.5 inch strips for our side outer borders and two 3.5 by 50.5 inch strips for top and bottom outer borders. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut two strips that I know are 44.5 inch long. So I'm just going to use the ruler and I'm just going to cut them slightly bigger so that we can trim them down exactly in a second. So just kind of making sure that I've got enough, and then we'll do it exact right after. So I'm going to take both of my strips, fold them in the center, and cut at the 22.25 inch line. So we need 44.5 inch strips. 44.5 divided by 2 is 22.25. So I'm going to cut that one, and I'll actually go ahead and mark in the center. Do the same thing on this other one. So 22.25. And I'm making sure I line up my ruler so I'll have a nice clean cut. Mark in the center. And then I'm going to put these on my board as D1. And now I've got to cut two that are 50.5 inches. I'm just going to take this leftover strip that I have and cut it in half, because I know that that'll be plenty. So they need to be 50.5. So if I take 50.5 divided by 2, that's 25.25. So again, make it nice and straight. And cut at 25.25. Mark in the center. And cut at 25.25. And mark in the center. And those are going to be your D2s. So now we're going to attach our outer borders. So my fabric D1 strips go on the sides of my quilt. So I'm going to measure the center of both of my sides first, and you're going to see that because we measured our inner borders and our outer borders, when you lay the outer borders on the inner borders, everything is going to lie flat and you won't have any of the little waviness going at all, and it's going to be super easy to put the outer borders down and it will come out nice and straight. So again, just make sure you've got right sides together, pin in the center, and on both sides, and throughout on both sides. So we're going to just pin and then go sew. And on these seams, I don't pay attention to which direction the seams go at all. I just put them on whichever way. It doesn't bother me. They don't need to go the same way. So just put this down. And as you get more experienced as a quilter, if you don't want seams in your outer borders or your inner borders, you could cut across the length of fabric, but I would not recommend that until you get to a very intermediate to advanced area, because if you cut on the length of fabric, there is no stretch or give, which you need as a beginner. So let's go sew this down. So now we're going to change our foot from an open toe foot back to a 1/4 inch foot. And this time I'm going to put the outer border on top. You're just putting 2 borders together. So, and they're not going to have to be eased in because you measured. So I'm just going to leave the outer border on top. Again, keep your quilt on your table instead of hanging off so it doesn't pull on you. I'm going to stitch, back stitch, and you can see that this one's going to be much easier to stitch because there's no seams. Back stitch, and do the same thing on the other side. And you will see that if you have measured all your borders, this is going to go together like a breeze. Back stitch, and now we can go press. And I still finger press even though it's the border. So we are on our very last border. You should be so proud of yourself that you have gotten this far, and it is looking beautiful. So I've got my D2 strips. I'm going to find the center of my top and bottom, and we're going to attach those borders. And then your quilt top will be done. And again, I'm just using my stomach to hold the quilt on the table so that it doesn't come off. And again, right sides together, match the centers and the ends. And do the other side. Now this one, I see that I have just a little bitty section of my seam, and that'll be okay. Most of it will be hidden. I could have planned better, so I just had one seam on this, but I tend not to think about it. Like right here, these two seams are going to be right next to each other, and that's okay. I don't ever worry about where the seams are, because when, like right now you see it, but once it's quilted, you're not going to see that. If you do or don't like that, you can pay attention to that as you're going. But in the end, when it's totally done, you're not going to notice that at all. So again, back stitch. And again, I only back stitch when I'm adding my borders. Most people do not do that, but it's just my personal preference. Go to the other side. And again, I'm keeping my quilt, all the weight of the quilt on my table. If you don't have a table to your left, maybe you could just put a little chair to your left, something to put the quilt on to keep the weight off of right here. That is your last seam on your quilt top. So you're just going to press just like we did throughout the entire quilt. And those two seams are right next to each other, and I think they actually look pretty good because they're nice and straight. And on that side, my two seams are right next to each other. They look so good. I didn't even plan it. I think it looks really good. But when it's quilted, you're not even going to see them. They're going to just sink right into your quilt top. So now I have everything added, and what I like to do when I'm done with my quilt top is I fold it into fourths, no matter what size it is. I fold it into fourths. And when you fold it, you're going to see that your quilt is square. Fold it into fourths. And then I do one last press. It'll just keep it nice and folded. You've got this last little press on here. Then you can fold it up and keep it until you're ready to quilt it. And this is just a personal preference of something I like to do. You don't have to do it, but I like to get it nice and flat so that it's ready when we're going to quilt it. Yay! Our quilt top is all done. I'm so excited you've joined me. I still have my leftover fabric E-strips, and you're just going to save those until we get to our binding, and then you can check out next week our videos on how you're going to finish your quilt. See you then.